Good morning, afternoon, and/or evening, and welcome back to Virginia and U.S. History with Mr. Pichet. Today we are going to be focusing on the three different regions of the original 13 English colonies in North America. And we're going to be answering this big picture question: how are these colonies different from each other? Before we get started, let's set the stage a little bit. So we're taking these 13 English colonies in North America and we are splitting them into three different regions: the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. Why are we doing that, you might ask? Well, it's because we love to try and simplify things and then end up making them more complicated than they were in the first place. And then, just to confuse you even more, we're going to talk about those three regions, and we're going to talk about three different types of characteristics of those regions that make them different from one another. We're going to talk about the geography, or the land, the economy, or how they made their money, and the politics, or how they structured their societies. So let's start with the Southern colonies, which includes the colony of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These colonies were settled by people known as Cavaliers. These people were English nobility, which means they were some kind of noble person in English society. And the King of England actually gave these people what's called a land grant, which means he basically gave them free land if they would agree to go and settle these areas. So these were basically some pretty wealthy people living in England, and the King of England came to them and was like, "Hey, I kind of need some people to go live in this dump. Like, would you mind?" And the Cavaliers, they were like, will there be women? No. Well, will there be wine? Also no. Well, what's in it for me then? I'm glad you asked. For the small price of $0, you can live in this swamp. So, geographically, the southern colonies, they have lots of flat land. The summers are very long and very hot. It doesn't get extremely cold in the winter, so all of this makes for a long growing season, which meant that these colonies were really, really good for large-scale farming on really big farms called plantations. And on those plantations, they grew cash crops, which were crops that were sold for a profit, and some of those cash crops were cotton, tobacco, rice, and indigo. However, if you weren't one of those Cavaliers that was lucky enough to live on the nice land, you got to live further inland in the Appalachian Mountain Range. And in that area, the economy was more based on subsistence farming, so only farming for what you needed, as well as hunting and trading. And of course, in these southern colonies, most of the work or most of the labor was provided by either indentured servants or people who were enslaved. Politically, this was a very landowner-dominated society, so in order to be able to vote in the southern colonies, in order to have any kind of power, you had to own land. They strongly believed in private property, and they also kept a close relationship with the King of England. For example, the King of England would appoint a governor who would rule over each of these southern colonies. Aside from being ruled by the King of England, many of these colonies developed a representative democracy where they would elect their own leaders to make laws within their own colonies. Obviously, these laws could not violate the laws of the English crown, but they were able to make laws that were for their specific region or their specific colony. Okay, let's move on to the middle colonies. The middle colonies are kind of different from the other two, so we need to pay close attention to these. The middle colonies consist of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And who settled here? Well, pretty much everybody, if we're being honest. There were Dutch immigrants, there were German immigrants, there were English immigrants, there were a ton of different religions that decided to settle in the middle colonies, and they came here for many different reasons. It's not really one single thing you can point to. Some came here seeking religious freedom, while others wanted to make a quick couple of dollars for themselves and were seeking economic opportunity, or maybe just looking to get away from the poverty that they faced in Europe. Geographically, there was a lot of fertile soil in the middle colonies. They had pretty warm summers, but kind of cold winters, so it was a little bit cooler than the southern colonies. So they had a shorter growing season than the southern colonies, but they were able to grow things successfully like wheat and grains. And so because of that, there wasn't really like huge plantations in the middle colonies, but their economy was based on small-scale farming. And because they had very good areas for ports or harbors in the middle colonies, they also developed an economy that was based on shipbuilding and trading. Because of how much success they had growing wheat and other grains, today we call them the breadbasket colonies. One of the most important things to know about the middle colonies is it was an area of religious tolerance. This area was home to so many different religious groups. There were the Quakers who lived in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, the Huguenots and the Jewish lived in New York, and the Presbyterians lived in New Jersey. And those are just to name a few. So because you have all these different religious groups living together in such close proximity to each other, they started to become more tolerant of one another and more accepting of their religious differences. Because you have so many people from so many different backgrounds, they developed a very flexible social structure where you could move up and down the social ladder, and they even developed a middle class of people, meaning you're not rich, but you're also not poor, and that middle class was made up of artisans and small farmers. Alright, and lastly, let's talk about the New England colonies, which are the northernmost region of the 13 colonies. These colonies consist of New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and technically Maine, but Maine was actually part of Massachusetts. These colonies were settled by the Puritans, that religious group that we talked about in the last lesson, and they came here looking for freedom from religious persecution. Geographically, this place sucked. Like, you thought those rich people in the southern colonies got a bad deal, having to live in a swamp? Yeah, try the mountains, buddy. Mountains are very rocky and very uneven. It's not really good for farming at all. And to top it all off, it's very, very cold in the New England colonies. So it meant they had a very, very short growing season, so they couldn't really grow a whole lot. And so what that means is they had to find other ways to survive or to make money, and so they relied more on lumbering because there was really large forests in the New England colonies. And then they take that lumber and they turn it into ships, and then they use those ships to go fishing or to go whaling, and then they turn the whales and the fish into fish and whale oil, and they trade it with other colonies or other countries. Oh, and they also had livestock. In the New England society, these Puritans lived a lifestyle of hard work and no waste. They believed in self-government. Remember talking about the Mayflower Compact and that system of self-government that they set up where these citizens in New England would go to town hall meetings and they would vote on laws in their own communities, which is called direct democracy. And again, this society was very, very religious. These Puritans were extremely religious, and the problem was they were intolerant of other people who didn't worship the same way that they did, or dissenters, or people like the Quakers. Originally, the Quakers had tried to settle in the New England colonies in Massachusetts, and when they got there, they realized that the Puritans didn't like anybody who didn't worship God the exact same way that they did. So basically, the Quakers got there and they were like, "Hello, fellow Christians." And the Puritans were like, "Oh, so you're a Christian, huh? You worship God? Well, that's great. Wait a minute. What kind of Christian are you exactly?" "Well, we're Quakers, and we're just so happy to be here and go to church with you guys every Sunday." Wrong answer, buddy. Get them out of here, put them on a ship, and send them to Rhode Island. And then they lived happily ever after. Except they didn't. Even after being forced into Rhode Island, they still had plenty of conflicts with the Puritans, and many of the Quakers who had already been exiled into Rhode Island then decided to leave again and go to Pennsylvania, a colony founded by William Penn. Alright, that's just about going to wrap it up for our lesson on the colonial regions. Make sure you go back and compare some of those differences and similarities between those three colonial regions. If you would like, feel free to watch our next lesson on mercantilism.